Hey guys, so I mentioned in my update video last week that I actually did manage to read more than I expected this summer while I was studying for my exam, and I thought that I would just go over everything I read for anyone who is curious. I'm gonna try to keep keep my thoughts pretty brief on each one. Some of these I read months ago, so my thoughts are a little bit stale by this point anyway, but I also don't want this video to be half hour long. So, yeah, I'm just gonna start with the first book that I read the week that I started my studying. That book that I started with was The Crossing by Cormac McCarthy, which is the second book in his Border trilogy, the first book in which is All the Pretty Horses. And I enjoyed this one a lot more than All the Pretty Horses. It was actually the first Cormac McCarthy book where his sort of Baroque and very sort of arguably pretentious, wordy prose actually worked for me, and where I liked it and thought it actually added to the story. I found this much more interesting than All the Pretty Horses. And then the third book in the Border trilogy, which I read right afterward, was Cities of the Plain, which I did not like as much as either of the first two. I, on the whole, found this a bit uninspired and a bit dull and a bit, honestly, repetitive from the first two in terms of the themes it explores. So yeah, I didn't like this one quite so much. The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, and I enjoyed the stories in here. There were some moments that I found very touching. I wouldn't call it a favorite or anything like that, but I had fun reading it. Next, complete shift in tone. We have Prison Writings, My Life is My Sundance by Leonard Peltier. And Leonard Peltier, for those who may not know, was a member of the American Indian movement back in the 1970s, who was basically framed for committing a murder. Well, framed, falsely accused anyway, of committing a murder, and so is serving out a life sentence. He's still in prison, he's still alive. And this is a book that he wrote from prison, which is kind of a memoir about his life before, during, and after the American Indian movement, his life while he's in prison, and a little bit about sort of the Native American spirituality that he's taking solace in while in prison. And I think that this would be most interesting to people who are already very interested in Leonard Peltier and in the American Indian movement. So if you're interested in that, then this might be something you'd be interested in. But if you're sort of coming to it cold, it may not do much for you, because there's not that many details of the American Indian movement, that many details of Leonard Peltier's life, even. It is a pretty short and brief book, but so, it won't bring you up to speed on that whole movement in history, or on Leonard Peltier's life, but if you already know some about that, then it would be interesting, I think. And then I moved to an anthology of poetry. I rarely read through anthologies of poetry from cover to cover, but I decided to read The Black Poets, which is edited by Dudley Randall, and this was published back, I think, in the 1970s, so it is missing, a good amount of very contemporary stuff, and it also has actually a fair number of poets whose work has kind of fallen into obscurity, I feel like, or at least who I don't hear much about, I don't hear discussed very often, and who I'd never heard of. But, it also has a lot of the big names, like Langston Hughes, and Claude McKay, and County Cullen, and, Amiri Baraka, Margaret Walker, Nikki Giovanni, among many others that you will know. And I thought it was quite a good anthology, just for getting introduced to those sorts of major poets. Definitely some poets whose work I will further explore, whether they're obscure or not, but yeah. And I read Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis, which I included in my top books of 2020 so far video, and so that kind of speaks for itself. I think this was excellent, a brilliant work of scholarship, and just, really well-argued, really an important and fascinating book, but I won't say much more about it other than that, because I talked about it in that other video. This next one is a buddy read, which I buddy read with Mark Nash. We read the selected poems of Rainer Maria Rilke with a translation and commentary by Robert Bly, and we read this as a part of Read German Books 2020, which is a reading event, sort of year-long reading event hosted by Britta Bowler and Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventure, and so obviously Rilke is a German writer, and so we read his poetry because we were both interested in him as a writer, but as a part of the event because he wrote in German originally. And we both liked parts of this. We both kind of thought that a selection of Rilke's poetry was a bit incomplete because a lot of his poetry, I feel like poems from individual volumes need the context of the whole volume, individual volume of poetry that it's from, to be fully grasped. And because this is a selection, it couldn't include every individual volume of Rilke's poetry. And so we kind of felt like at times some of the context was lost for some of these poems. But some of them were really, really beautiful. I think I will read more Rilke. I will find, a complete poems, and I think he'll become a new favorite poet for me. And the commentaries by Robert Bly were really good. We're pretty, we're pretty basic, but really nice at just sort of grounding you in what these poems are about and what Rilke is getting at in some of them. So yeah, it is a volume that I like. And what's also nice about it is it's bilingual, so it has it'll have the German on one side and the English on the other, which is kind of cool, even though I don't, obviously read German, but yeah. Yet another radical shift. This is Intellectual Memoirs, New York, 1936 to 1938 by Mary McCarthy, which is a memoir. I believe this was actually her last book. I believe it was published posthumously. This is a memoir of 2 years in Mary McCarthy's life where she was, very young, still kind of figuring out her life, kind of making a lot of mistakes in her love life and in her professional life, still kind of at that period in her writing life where she was just working for a pittance, writing, book reviews and such, and I really, really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it because of how it portrays the writing life, or the less glamorous side of the writing life, I suppose. And I just liked how sort of frank she was about her love life and the mistakes she made and everything. And yeah, it was a good read. Next is another buddy read. This is The Obelisk Gate by N.K. Jemisin, the second book in her Broken Earth trilogy. And I buddy read this with Brian from Bookish, and we both enjoyed it. I felt like this one was not quite as engaging as the first book. It wasn't quite insightful in terms of the exploration of the characters, I thought, and moved much more slowly, was much more sort of meditative and discursive than the first one. Well, less actually happens. But it was still good. It was still interesting, and Brian and I are both still looking forward to buddy reading the third book. And then two more books that both appeared on my top books of 2020 list, so I won't talk about them too much. It's 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus by Charles Mann, which I buddy read with Patrice Jones and Peg from the History Shelf, and yeah, we all found this just fascinating, revelatory, educational, thought-provoking. We all loved it, or at least I did. I think Patrice and Peg both did too, but they can correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, this was a great book. Highly recommend. If the subject of the book, of the title and subtitle sounds at all interesting to you, I would recommend it. And then Cultural Amnesia: Necessary Memories from History and the Arts by Clive James. Again, just brilliantly written, aphoristic, funny at parts, insightful, educational, all sorts of things. It's just a great book. It is an undertaking, but it's a book that really keeps you reading. Just because I loved just being in the presence of Clive James on the page, because he's so witty and funny and interesting to listen to what he has to say on the different historical events and people he discusses in this book. Yeah, it's a long book, but you won't want to put it down, I think. Alright, now we go back to poetry. This is New Poets of Native Nations, which is edited by Heid E. Erdrich. And this is an anthology of Native American poets whose first work was published in the 21st century. So they're all relatively young. And any anthology like this, like with the Black poets, any anthology is going to be hit or miss. They're always going to be poets in the anthology whose work really resonates with you, and poets who just, you know, just don't do it for you. You know, it's the same if it were an anthology of music, I think. It would just inevitably be hit or miss, because you just don't love every musical artist out there. Yeah, there were some poets who I definitely would love to explore more of in this. The two poets who I think struck me the most were Layli Long Soldier, who I believe is Lakota Sioux, and Natalie Diaz, who is a Mojave poet. They were both just excellent. They just blew me away. So I will be exploring more of their work. The next, for the next book, the cover won't tell you much, but this is Reborn, Journals and Notebooks, 1947 to 1963 by Susan Sontag. It ranges over a lot of topics. I mean, she'll have entries about a book she's reading, or some music, or a film she's watched, or something like that. And then there are a lot of entries that are just about what's going on in her life with her relationships, and her schooling and her traveling and such. And it definitely sort of varied in how interesting it was, as I think would happen with any book like this, because, you know, not every entry is going to be of equal interest to any particular reader. But I did find parts of it very, very quotable. I will definitely be reading more of Susan Sontag's journals, and it seems like a good primer on sort of learning about her life as well, because there's a lot of, again, about what's going on in her life in this book. Then I reread Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Yeah, I read this while Jane Austen July was going on, although I didn't necessarily read it specifically for Jane Austen July, but I also watched two adaptations of it. I watched the film with Keira Knightley that's directed by Joe Wright, and I watched the miniseries with Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy, and I can't remember the actress's name now. Yeah, and I liked both of those. I enjoyed this book a lot. I read this book for the first time when I was, I believe, 17. I had to read it for school, and I hated it then, and I did not hate it this time. I liked it a lot more. I don't feel like I love it in the way that a lot of people seem to, you know, but I definitely now see why people love it so much, and I did enjoy it, large parts of it. You know, I really like the journey that Elizabeth Bennet goes on with, the journey that Mr. Darcy goes on as well, and I really enjoyed the film and the miniseries, so I'm very glad I reread that. And then a piece of nonfiction, this is Religion as We Know It by Jack Miles, and this is actually sort of a republication of the introduction that he wrote to the Norton Anthology of World Religions, which was just an anthology of religious texts from the major world religions. So this is sort of, they took his introduction to that whole collection and just published it as a book. And what this book is essentially about, it's kind of supposed to be an introduction to the study of religion in a sense, but basically what he does is he traces the history of how human beings came to think of religion as like a separate entity. So, you know, before the modern and early modern period, religion was not like a separate, you know, arena that people thought of. You know, you weren't religious or non-religious, because religion was so thoroughly integrated into people's everyday lives and into how society worked and into how the government worked, that no one really thought of religion as this separate thing that could have things done to it, or could be believed in or not. It was just taken for granted that everyone was religious. It's a bit hard for me to describe in so short a time, but it was an interesting book. If you're interested in the study of religion, this could be very, very interesting. And it's very, very short, and it has like super wide margins, so you can get through it in a couple of days. Another buddy read, this is Between the Acts by Virginia Woolf, which is her last novel, which she actually didn't manage to finish before she died. And I buddy read this with Britta Bowler, and we found it very, very interesting. It's a very interesting novel on a kind of stylistic and formal level. It's sort of written in what I would call a kind of collective stream of consciousness, where the stream of consciousness isn't inside of one person's head, but it's sort of looking at everyone. So, like, rather than being inside of one person's mind and tracking their thoughts over a period, you're sort of, the consciousness is standing outside everyone, but it's also omniscient in the sense that it knows what's going on in everyone's head at once, in a way. And so it kind of will jump from character to character within a room or within a building or something. And it was very interesting in that sense and had some really gorgeous writing. But the story itself is a bit hard to make much of, I guess. I feel like Britta and I were a bit underwhelmed by the story, and we kind of felt like yeah, if the story itself isn't that interesting, then it's hard to love the book, no matter how stylistically brilliant it is. And so I think that's kind of how we both felt about this. But definitely worth reading, definitely interesting. I will definitely reread it at some point to see if I can make more sense of it. Alright, we're getting close to the end. On my drive home to visit my parents, I at one point did drive to New York to visit my parents. I drove, I didn't stay in hotels or anything like that. We were safe and everything, so I wasn't I wasn't being reckless and going out into many places in New York. But on that drive, which is about 20 hours, I listened to some audiobooks. And the first audiobook that I listened to was of Paradise Lost by John Milton, which was a reread for me. And I ended up loving it. I mean, I love Paradise Lost so much, but it is not the best book to listen to on audiobook because the language is very complex and just has very sort of convoluted syntax, and so it's not the easiest thing to listen to on audiobook, even though it was a reread, which tends to make that sort of thing easier. But that's okay, because I still loved Satan just as much this time as I did the first time. I still found Eve to be a fascinating character, just as much the second time as the first time. Yeah, I did end up enjoying it, even though I struggled with the audiobook a bit. And then the other book I listened to on audiobook was Dakota, A Spiritual Geography by Kathleen Norris, which is kind of a collection of essays about the Dakotas, specifically the sort of western parts of the Dakotas, which are a lot more sparsely populated than the eastern parts where there are some actual cities. And just sort of how it feels to be out in the Dakotas, what the people who live there are like, and so on and so forth. And she also kind of discusses monasteries that are out in the Dakotas, which I thought was pretty interesting. And sort of she actually compares living in the Dakotas just in general to living in a monastery, which I thought was an interesting comparison. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I enjoy reading about that part of the world. And then right after that, I went back to John Milton and read Paradise Regained, which is obviously the sequel to Paradise Lost, where Jesus is in the desert and resists the temptation of Satan. And I didn't find that one quite as fun or interesting. There were some good verses that I liked and that I underlined, but on the whole, it was a bit dull in comparison. And then I decided to do some preparatory reading for ShakeTube. I don't know that much about the playwrights who wrote around the time of Shakespeare, even though I know, I've also obviously read Shakespeare and know a lot about him. I don't know much about his contemporaries, and so I decided to pick up The Genius of the Early English Theatre, which is edited by Sylvan Barnett, Morton Berman, and William Berto. And so this is an anthology of several plays, 3 anonymous morality plays, Abraham and Isaac, The Second Shepherd's Play, and Everyman. And then we have Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, which I have read twice before, Macbeth by William Shakespeare, which I had read 3 times before, Volpone by Ben Jonson, which I'd never read, and Samson Agonistes by John Milton. And I thought this was a really interesting collection. The plays really do kind of thematically bounce off one another, because it starts with the morality plays, and then it goes into Dr. Faustus, which does have the structure of a sort of morality play, in the sense that Faustus does get, swallowed by the devil at the end, but also is a bit more complex than the morality plays tend to be, because it has such a striking and charismatic characterization of, Dr. Faustus. And then Macbeth, of course, which is also modeled to a degree on a morality play, because obviously Macbeth gets killed in the end, and he is, sort of Shakespeare's most potent not really embodiment, but potent exploration of evil. But again, a bit more complex, because, Macbeth is also such a like charismatic, striking character. And then we have both Volpone and Samson Agonistes, which sort of deal with similar themes as well. I enjoyed the collection. I kind of wish that they had picked something other than Samson Agonistes to include as a last play, because Samson Agonistes isn't really a play. It's more like a dramatic poem. I mean, as far as I know, it's not usually like staged in productions. So I would have preferred, something by like John Webster or Thomas Fletcher. And I would have preferred to hear from another contemporary or rough contemporary of Shakespeare's rather than this one poem by John Milton that was sort of written as a tragedy, but which really isn't staged much. But other than that, I really like the collection. It was nice to finally read some Ben Jonson and to read some old morality plays. Those were definitely very interesting. And this volume 2 has a really nice introduction by Sylvan Barnett, the general introduction, and then a smaller introductions to each individual work. So that made it very accessible. The last 4 that I have are all plays as well. I've been in a very dramatic mood. I think because Shake Tube is coming, where we're going to be reading a great playwright. I'm in the mood for some drama. So I reread Romeo and Juliet. This is my 3rd time reading it. I love Romeo and Juliet. I'm a sucker for romantic stories like Romeo and Juliet, and I actually also rewatched the Franco Zeffirelli film, and I love that. So I love Romeo and Juliet. I will defend it. I will die on this hill. It has its detractors, but I will die on this hill. And then I read The Caretaker and the Dumb Waiter by Harold Pinter. Pinter is always a fascinating playwright. He's so, enigmatic. He's one of those playwrights where, it's where the language isn't difficult. The language, in fact, is quite pithy. A lot of what people say is very kind of simple and straightforward, but it's often what is difficult about Pinter is it's difficult to figure out like what's supposed to be going on. What are these characters thinking? Why are these characters doing the things they're doing? And where is this play going? That's what's difficult about Pinter, and it's always a bit hit or miss for me with Pinter. I didn't care too much about The Caretaker. I thought it was interesting, but didn't really move me. But The Dumb Waiter I actually really liked. I think it actually might be my favorite Harold Pinter play now. And I think I've now read 7. It's kind of a Waiting for Godot-like story, which is I think why I liked it so much. But yeah, it is still enigmatic, and there are still many different ways that you could interpret it, but I thought it was very, very interesting. And then just today, actually, I read another Harold Pinter, which is A Slight Ache, which, again, enigmatic, weird, you don't quite know what's going on, it ends very strangely, but interesting. So, and then finally, a book that I finished this morning as well is Hedda Gobbler by Ibsen. This is 4 plays by Ibsen, and I've now read 3 of the plays in this collection. The only one I haven't read is The Master Builder, and this collection has A Doll's House, Ghosts, and Hedda Gobbler. And I finished this morning reading Hedda Gobbler, and I thought it was great. Of the 3 Ibsen plays I've read, I think it might be my favorite, which is saying a lot because I've liked all 3 of those Ibsen plays that I've read. I think he's gonna be like one of my favorite playwrights. But yeah, Hedda Gobbler, I've heard that Hedda Gobbler is thought of as a kind of female counterpart to Hamlet, and I can see that, and I kind of love it. I think she's fascinating. I really want to watch a film adaptation of this. I would love to see a stage production, but I don't. For one thing, I don't live near any, big serious theaters aside from the school theater. But also, with COVID-19 going on, the theaters aren't going. But yeah, I thought Hedda Gobbler was brilliant. So anyway, that's what I've read this summer. I think this video turned out to be a lot longer than I meant it to be, but we will work with it. So anyway, if you've read any of these, give me your thoughts. I hope you're all having a decent week. I hope you all had a good summer, a good reading summer, and such. And I will let you go. Thank you for watching, guys. Bye.